Chapters 19 and 20. Chapter 19. Cat and Mouse. On Sunday, my mom decided to drive the cars separately to church. When I asked why, she said she wanted to drop a coconut cake by for Widow Thompson, the Carlsons' old neighbor. "You can come with me if you want," she said when I hung around in the kitchen. So after church, I drove the two of us out to the Carlson farmhouse along County 23. The closer we got, the tighter my tie felt around my neck, and I could tell my mom was nervous too. She kept fiddling with the plastic food wrap over the top of the cake, worrying the toothpicks were going to punch through the covering would ruin the frosting. We pulled into Fern Thompson's driveway, which was actually an offshoot of the Carlson driveway, and parked near her front walk. I got out and opened the car door for my mom, both of us stealing solemn and nervous glances towards the Carlson farmhouse. Charlie and Bert had been by to clean things up like my dad had promised, so the chalk marks were gone and the blood-stained rug had been burned. But if that had been meant as an exorcism, it hadn't worked. The place still looked empty and inhabited at the same time. We went up to Fern Thompson's cement steps and I knocked. My mom didn't wait for a reply before trying the knob and opening it up a crack. "Fern? Hello, Fern. It's Linda Jensen and Michael." We stepped into the linoleum entryway just as Widow Thompson was getting up from her living room chair. Steve's old tomcat swayed a few steps ahead of her with his tail in the air. Then he jumped up onto the kitchen table to say hello. My mom gave the cat a look, but when Mrs. Thompson gave no objection, she just said, "Michael, take care not to let the cat out." "It's all right," Mrs. Thompson said. "He won't go, not even if I try and shove him through the door." "That's a very pretty cake. I hope you like coconut." She said. "I'll put some coffee for us to enjoy it with." She nodded to me and I said hello. But I think my being there made her kind of sad. Maybe I reminded her of Steve. We didn't have the same build or the same coloring, but being the same age might have been enough. She moved around her kitchen, setting out 3 small plates and 3 forks. Only 2 cups of coffee, figuring I was too young to drink any. She and my mother chatted, and I tried to pet Steve's cat, but seemed shy of being touched. Not by Mrs. Thompson, though, who scooped him up with one arm and set him on the back of the sofa. I remember wishing that the old Tom had been younger, so he would live longer and give her more company. "Would you like a big slice of cake, Linda, or a smaller one?" Fern asked. "I never say no to a big slice. I just won't have sugar in my coffee." "Your boy will have to have a big slice, too, so I won't have much left over." "Yes, ma'am," I said, and wandered to the living room where they talked about church and what my mom used to make the frosting. The Carlson house was clearly visible through the front windows just across the small yard and driveway, close enough to give the impression that it was looking back at me. The night of the murders, Widow Thompson would have been able to see right into the living room, except that the curtains had been drawn closed. Earlier that evening, she'd been able to see Mr. Carlson going to and from the barns. She had been able to see everything they did on that last day. When Bert had interviewed her, she said that Steve came home around 7 o'clock, which checked out. He'd had dinner over at Kathy Ferry's house that night and stayed afterwards to watch a little TV. "Come and have some cake, Michael," my mom said. I went and took my plate and a fork, then wandered off again so they might be able to keep visiting. But when my mom excused herself to the bathroom, Mrs. Thompson asked, "Michael, how's that girlfriend of Steve's doing?" "Kathy?" I asked. "I guess she's pretty upset. They hadn't been going out long. They weren't a couple, but I know she liked him a lot." "I never did see him take her home that night," Mrs. Thompson said. "I must have dozed off, like I dozed off during—" She looked down at her cake, but then she smiled. She seemed like a nice girl. "She is," I said. Then I stopped. "What do you mean you never saw Steve take her home? Kathy was never at the Carlsons that night." "She wasn't?" Mrs. Thompson put her finger to his lips. "But I'm sure that she was. She had his jacket on over her shoulders, and he took them in through the back door." I froze. The girl she saw had to be Marie. "Them," I said. "Who was with Steve and Kathy?" You said he took them in through the back door. Who was them?" "Oh." The widow blinked a few times like she was trying to remember. No one, she said finally. It was just him and his girlfriend. But at first she hadn't been sure. That uneasy feeling crept up my collar, but she was an older lady and probably couldn't trust her memory when it came to a lot of things. Why didn't you tell Bert or my dad that Kathy had been there that night? I asked. Oh, she said. Well, I didn't want to bring her up. Being a young girl and out late with a boy, even a nice boy like Stephen, it didn't seem like any of my business. I would have asked more, but my mom returned from the bathroom. I turned back to the window. The Carlsons had a bright light mounted on a pole above their driveway to light the way between the house and the barns. If it had been bright enough that night for Mrs. Carlson to see Steve and Marie, and where they went, she couldn't have missed someone else. The killer must have come later, after she had already nodded off. Except she had said them, that Steve had taken them around the back of the house. Maybe she misspoke, but I didn't think so. I wish someone would move into that house, Mrs. Thompson said to us before we left. But I suppose no one will. Come next summer, all those flowers will need to be tended. When we got home, I told my dad what the widow had told me, and he cursed Bert under his breath and said he would re-interview her himself. My mother just stared at me aghast that I would question Fern Thompson while she had been away in the bathroom. That was a sneaky thing to do, Michael, she said. But I hadn't meant to do it. It had just happened. I didn't regret it, though, because between what Mrs. Thompson had said and what Percy and I had seen in the woods, I was starting to feel like I was being toyed with. That Monday I went back to the jail to see Marie. What? She said. And what? She said, and I pulled out the piece of paper I had stuffed into my pocket. I crudely sketched the markings we've seen cut into Percy's trees. I've never been much of an artist, and I kept messing it up. I must have drawn it 30 or 40 times. In the end, my bedroom was littered with symbols staring up at me in furious black ink, large and small, over and over and over. Marie studied it, her eyes lingering on the inverted crosses. I'd already tried to explain it to myself. Percy and I could have missed those carvings on the walk out. We were distracted. We could have covered over the other footprints with our own. But none of that really stuck, and I couldn't stop thinking about something that Percy said right before I left to go home with my dad. The carvings were deep, he said, so deep those trees might never heal. I didn't know how strong someone would have to be to step that far into the wood. I just knew that I wouldn't have been able to do it, not even if I'd been leaning over a log on the ground. Marie handed the paper back to me. They're only games. Games? I asked. Yeah, she said. He's just showing off. It must be quite the novelty having me locked up. I suppose he didn't figure it would take this long. I suppose he's enjoying watching, knowing I didn't get away. I studied her quietly. The things she said about the blood drinker didn't always make sense. She made her incarceration sound like it was planned, and also incarceration, oh my lord, sounded like it was planned, and also a fortunate surprise. Does he want to hurt me, Marie? Does he want to hurt my family? He might want to, but he wouldn't dare. What do you mean? I asked. I assumed she meant that attacking me would be too big a risk, but the way she said it seemed to imply something else. Like she had forbidden it. Like she had that power over him. That thought only occurred to me later. It was only when I was away from her that I could consider what she was in her role in the murders. I knew everyone thinks I thought she was completely innocent. A victim, a hostage. But Marie was never as simple as that. Victim, killer, one thing or another. Are you afraid of him? Of course not, she said. Why would I be afraid of him? Because he killed people, I half shouted, frustrated. Or was he ever there at all? Marie's eyes widened. How did you get to the Carlson house that night, Marie? Your friend Stephen picked us up. We were walking along the road and he stopped to check on us. We? I asked. Widow Thompson said she saw you go into the house with Steve, and only you. Widow Thompson doesn't know what she saw. I never killed anyone. You can't do this, I said. Tell me a killer is in my town and not tell me who he is? Give me no way to protect myself besides hanging garlic in my window? Marie laughed. That wouldn't work. I know it won't, not any more than holy water or a wooden stake, because he's just a man. If he's just a man, then why didn't any of them run? She asked. Why didn't they fight? He never tied any of them up. Doesn't that seem suspicious to you, that they would lay there and let the life drain out of them? She licked her lips, almost like someone had convinced them it wasn't happening. I glanced at our old kitchen table where the tape recorder sat whirring. I hadn't brought my pen and paper, but I'd switched on the recorder the moment I came into the room. But that wasn't always true, I said. Sometimes they ran. The truck driver, Monty Lutrino, and the hitchhiker who was found with them. Their bodies had been found almost a mile apart. One of them must have run. Marie shrugged, and I sat down on one of the kitchen chairs. It was strange, but talking about the murders put me at ease. They were real as the graves in the photographs in the files. They weren't an imagined monster stalking us through the woods and leaving me presents of snakes on the bench seats of cars. What about Stephen Hill? I asked. The other service station worker who was found in the field across the highway. He had run. Sometimes he let them run, Marie said. Why? So he could chase them. What about the way Stephen Hill was found? I asked. Stephen Hill was presumed killed on August 18th in the same attack as Jeff Booker, though his body wasn't found until a day later, abandoned in a field across from the service station. His corpse had been in a different state than the others. Lying on his back with his pants around his ankles, the deep bloodless cuts in his thighs laid open to the Iowa sky. The investigators, I said, and cleared my throat, thought it might indicate a sexual element. The investigators are disgusting men, Marie spat. She lay down on her bed and rolled onto her stomach. Are you thinking about that? No. Of course you are. You're thinking about it and those pretty nurses. You're thinking about the other marks on me. She pushed up onto her elbows. Have you ever gone all the way with a girl? What does that have to do with anything? I asked. But no, I haven't. Marie rolled over again and sat up. Of course you haven't. When you do, you'll realize that there are lots of other things to think about. So, those investigators, you don't think they slept with a girl either? Marie laughed. You've got me there. I guess maybe men just never stop thinking about it. The way they pursue. She trailed off. My stepfather wasn't young when he met my mother, but every time he showed up at our door, you'd have thought it was to go to the senior prom. I thought you said he was terrible. He wasn't at first. At first he was good, kind of stupid. He used to brag that he had an ancestor who was a cowboy, one of the famous ones from those parts. But my stepfather was the least cowboy-looking man I'd ever seen, always in a suit, always shined shoes. What about your father? I asked. We lived by a train yard. He was one of those real men, left before I was 7. Was he a transient? No, he just had someplace to go. He was just smart enough not to put down roots. But you were a root, I wanted to say. You and your mother. But before I could, Marie asked, do you think I should die? You didn't do the killing, I said quietly. But if I let them die, does it make a difference? It's not for me to say. Well, it's for someone to. She reached down and touched her scars. I cut my hand the first time he saw me. I think that's why he noticed. It was at the roadhouse where I worked. I'd been washing glasses, sharp glass and warm water. Why did he pick you? I asked. Why did you go? I don't know. You said he loved me, said I was special. What was special about you? I don't know. Maybe he thought I'd be willing to go along with it. That would make me pretty special. But you didn't go along with it? No, I already told you. I never killed anyone. Who was he, Marie? I told you. But what was his name? His name doesn't matter, she said, because it wasn't his real one. I sat back and eyed the tape recorder again. In the months to come, I would sometimes forget that it was there and we were being recorded. I have an almost vitriolic resentment for it now and its mechanical intrusion on some of the most intimate moments of my life. All right, I said. Then why him? I couldn't have It couldn't have been just because he looked like James Dean. I never said he looked like James Dean. I said he looked like a film star. Yeah, well, same difference. He was charming, she said. I wouldn't say he was kind, but he was kind to me, and his smile was full of fangs, I prodded, and she gave me a look. If he had fangs, what would he need the straight razor for? She pursed her lips, and I resisted the urge to mutter about what kind of vampire didn't have fangs. But even if there was some kind of attraction, after you saw him kill, how could you go on with it? Did he threaten you? Promise to protect you? He promised that after it was over, I would never need to be protected again. I sat back, because you would be like him. A blood drinker like him, she said. The Carlsons were supposed to be mine, my first, but I didn't want to do it. Only he had the baby and he kept saying... I shook my head and stopped her. Mr. McBride said I should let her talk, but it wasn't right. This is grotesque, Marie, I said. It's indecent. These are real people. These were my friends. Stop with the monsters. Tell the truth. Marie just sighed. All these bodies without blood, she said, and you won't believe in vampires, yet you believe in God. That's different. How? Do you believe in God? I asked her. I guess, she said softly. And I'm still not scared of him. What about this? She held up my scrap of paper. Cut into a tree. What about everything I've told you? The tricks to fool them into not struggling. What about me, covered in the Carlsons' blood? There has to be an explanation, I said. And I gave it to you, she said. We didn't just slash people and leave them to bleed. What was our motive? You were fleeing. You panicked and stole cars and hitched a ride with Steve on your way to Canada. Who chased you and Percy through the woods? Maybe no one. Maybe we mistook it all. Where was the blood? She asked, and I looked away. You still don't believe me, she said quietly, but you're starting to. Chapter 20, Black Deer Falls, November 1958. I stayed away from the jail a while after that, for nearly a week, and didn't go back until the 12th. If Maria believed what I said, then she was deluded. But deluded or not, I knew what Pilsen would eventually make of it. It was a motive. She had gone along with the killings in exchange for what she thought would be eternal life. Then again, if she was making it up as she went, I didn't know why she would choose to tell that story. I only knew she was doing a damn fine job. Maria and the murders had taken over my entire life. I walked through my days with my mind on nothing else. More than once I'd crossed the street to nearly get flattened by a passing car. I'd been speaking with Marie almost every day, and was still no closer to finding the truth. She'd given me a description of the killer's home, not a cave or a castle or a burrow dug into the ground, if that's what you're thinking, Michael, but left out anything that would allow us to locate it. Sometimes, when she talked about him, she sounded dreamy. Other times, her words were clipped and bitter. She had called him a bastard once, when he left her at the Carlson farmhouse. That bastard wanted me to get caught. All the while, the search for the killer continued. Authorities were still certain of catching him. He was flustered now, the paper said. He had to be, when his flight from the Carlson house had been so fast and sloppy that he'd left his accomplice behind. Early in the month, the FBI came in and conducted a very embarrassing series of interrogations where Marie shouted at them and called them all no-good cheats. They kept her under lights for almost 36 hours, but according to Charlie, when it was over, she bounced out of there like she was fresh from a feather pillow. The agents, on the other hand, looked like they had been hit by a truck. A reporter from the Times would say later that it was like Marie had us under a spell, that the Heartland had held her captive by the murders all summer, and now were held captive by the murderess. It was a nice turn of phrase, made for a good story, but he was an idiot. I don't think he ever set one foot in Black Deer Falls, and if he did, he didn't spend his time talking to any of us. On my way to the jail one afternoon, I ran into our neighbor, Mr. Vanderpool, who had managed the Buy and Bag before retirement a few years ago. "How's it going over there?" he asked. "At the jail?" "I don't think I'm allowed to discuss it, sir. My dad would run my hide." "And right he should, but I won't lie, there are plenty of people who'd prefer your dad had turned her over and let that prosecutor from Nebraska handle the mess. Having her here, lingering, it isn't helping anyone to move on from the Carlsons' deaths. Yes, sir, I said, even though that was the very reason she'd had to stay. The Carlsons were ours. If my father had given up and let her go, we might never have gotten the answers we deserved. They'd have called him a coward and accused him of passing the buck. How much longer do you think it'll be? Mr. Vanderpool asked. I really couldn't say, sir. I see you coming and going from Matt McBride's office over at the Star. This will all be written up for us, then. Everything she said, everything she's done. He smiled harder when he asked that, a forced smile that stretched across his face. I'm not sure what will be released to the papers, I said. It's not really my story. It's Marie's story. I'm just taking it down. Marie's story, he said, and the corner of his mouth fell, though his teeth continued to show. Well, you can hurry her up, can't you, and then send her to the chair? He tipped his hat and went home. Blackdeer Falls was not under Marie's spell. Neither was the rest of the country. The headlines that had sprung up in the wake of Marie's arrest were in black ink and bold letters. They declared her the blood-covered demoness of the bloodless murders. The article said she was cold-hearted, an accomplice who refused to give up her man. And of course there was the picture. Always the same picture on the steps of the courthouse in the Capitol. The one snap, the one instant where she appeared to be smiling, with my mother's lipstick darkly crimson on her upturned mouth. I don't know how many times I went back over my notes, over and over them, wondering if the story I would write would show a different side of her, or if it would turn out the same. Mr. Vanderpool's words rang in my ears as I walked into the jail that day. Send her on to the chair. I didn't know if I could face her, if I could look at the bars and the painted door, the small square of sky through the window. Suddenly everything seemed over already, and it seemed like such a waste that she would spend the rest of her life in that cell. I made it through the doors of the station, but I couldn't go up. Nancy saw me sort of standing there. Come with me, she said, for a breath of fresh air. She took me out around the building and leaned against the brick wall as she lit a cigarette. Some breath of fresh air, I quipped. How many packs do you think you've given Marie by now, anyway? She held the pack out to me, and I took one. Just one, the way I did sometimes after a few too many beers with Percy. Don't tell your dad, she said as she lit it up for me. They shouldn't have made you do this, she said. It's too much for someone your age. Marie's younger than I am, I said, and she took a long drag. Nancy was so pretty, bright blonde hair and ruby lips. How's Charlie? I asked, and she shoved me lightly. Mind your own business. We smoked for a while in the cold quiet. You've taken a shine to Marie, I said. I guess I have. I guess you have too. She ashed onto the pavement and smudged it with the toe of her low-heeled shoe. People probably think we're crazy. But she's just a kid. I don't want to see anything worse happen to her than what already has. You don't think she did it then? I asked. She says she didn't. She doesn't seem like... Nancy trailed off. She just seems lost. Tough and lost. Images of the murder victims flashed through my head. That was the week I'd finally looked at the photos of the Carlson murder, if you could call it looking. I'd sat at the desk in my room and held my breath while I flipped through the pages. When I got to the shot of Steve's body lying curled on the rug, I shut the file and sat there with my face in my hands. Why didn't they fight? I asked Nancy. Do you ever wonder about that? Maybe they were afraid. Maybe he told them he was going to let them go if they didn't. But when he cut them, why didn't they fight then? Nancy shrugged. Have you ever felt the difference between a shallow cut and a deep one? There isn't much, just a sense of panic. Remember William Hayward, how he died? William Hayward, the movie star? He hit his head and cut it deep and then sat down drinking gin until he stopped breathing. Just sat there on his bedroom floor, not knowing he was bleeding to death. She stubbed out her cigarette and picked up the butt to toss it in the trash. Maybe none of the victims knew either until it was too late. You coming in? I think I'll stay out here a while longer. Thanks for the smoke, Nancy. Just get the smell off before your dad sees you, she said, and went back inside. I stood there in the cold and thought about Marie. I thought about the scars on our arms, the shallow and the deep ones, and I thought about Nancy and why she knew what they felt like. Nancy had moved to Blackdeer Falls 5 years before from one of the small states out east. Looking at her now, so pretty, flirting with Charlie, you'd think she was never sad a day in her life. The fire that had killed her husband and baby had been an accident, a freak thing. Sparks from the flue had caught on the rug, and when she woke coughing, Nancy had run out on instinct. By the time she realized what was happening, the blaze was too high for her to go back in. So she just stood in her yard and screamed until the fire truck came. We never would have known about that, except when she first came to town. She used to have drinks at the Rusty Eagle, the old army bar between the butcher and the bus garage. And when she'd had enough, the whole story came out. How much she'd lost, how much she hated herself. It wasn't her fault, of course. It could have happened to anyone. But there are women in town who to this day refuse to speak to Nancy. They think it's indecent that she could dare go on, that she smiles, that she flirts with Charlie. I used to think they were just being ugly. Now, after knowing Marie, I just think they're mistaken. The woman they condemn doesn't even exist. The mother, the young wife, she died in the fire with her husband and baby. Whoever Nancy is now had to leave that all behind. Since the carvings in the wood behind Percy's house, there had been no further signs of the blood drinker, and I had almost begun to believe we had imagined the whole of it. Weeks had passed, and Mo had finally stopped sitting by the fire in his backyard pit with a pile of beer cans built into a pyramid and a rifle in the crook of his arm, and Percy said they hadn't seen anything but does and squirrels in their woods since the day of the search. He also kicked slush at my shoes because I'd scared off his buck. But if the buck had moved on, all for the better of it. Those woods weren't safe. For my part, I wasn't taking any chances. I still made Dawn keep her cat in, and I still walked her home from school. "Can we stop and get ice cream soda?" she asked as we cut down Main Street. "Only you would want to get ice cream in November," I said. Dawn was made from Minnesota. She kicked her blankets off year-round. She'd been that way since she was a baby. My mom said she'd had a real time of it, keeping her tiny feet in socks. We started up the block to Anderson's drugstore where the soda fountain was. Dawn wanted a chocolate soda topped with a scoop of butter brickle. I was after a hot dog with extra mustard and a root beer float. The streets were busy for a weekday afternoon, probably because the sun was out and made town look warmer, even though it wasn't, and full of unfamiliar faces. Black Deer Falls was never so small that I knew anyone, but lately, the people I didn't know seemed to know me, and that was an uncomfortable feeling. "Maybe not today, Dawn, okay?" I said and stopped walking. She frowned, and when I looked up the street again, I saw Mr. McBride and his wife. They were arm in arm, and brown paper bags of groceries were tucked in each of their outer elbows like bookends. Mrs. McBride saw us first and whispered, and Mr. McBride looked up and shouted hello. He gave a little wave with the hand holding his groceries and almost spilled them in the process. I took my hand out of my pocket and waved back, then put my arm around Dawn to hurry her along home. I felt guilty repaying his warm greeting with something so brief, but I wasn't up to talking. I thought about it the rest of the short walk to her house, wondering whether he'd taken it personally, or if I'd just flat out hurt his feelings. "What's that on our door?" Dawn asked. "What?" She pointed with a red mitten. Something was hanging on our front door, like a wreath hung for Christmas, except whatever this was hung straight down. It was 3 feet long and narrowed at the bottom, and it was dripping. I knew what it was before Dawn did, but my legs kept moving forward like in a dream as I tried to make sense of what it was doing there. I kept on walking towards it like a fool until Dawn put her hands to her face and started to scream. "Dawn! Dawn!" I shouted, and bent down to take her by the shoulders. I tried to pull her in close, but she fought me. She wouldn't stop screaming. In the corner of my eye, I saw our neighbor's door open and Mr. Shawman and Mrs. Shawman step out to see what was wrong. Others would join her soon enough. Dawn's screams must have been audible for at least 2 blocks. But all I kept thinking was that my mother was inside. My mother was inside, and I didn't want her to open the door. It was a snake hanging down the white wood, the same snake that someone had left in his sack on Percy's front seat. Someone had taken her and nailed her to our front door right below the brass knocker. Good God! I heard Mr. McBride's gasped words as his running footsteps came to a halt. Mrs. Schumann approached on the other side, hands over her open mouth. Mrs. Bonaway and Miss Monson, the spinster sisters who lived 2 houses down, crept towards us with wide eyes. They made me sick to my stomach, those eyes. They made me cold all over. The snake was terrible, and here we were, my family, in the middle of it again. And then my mother came to the door. "What's going on?" she asked. The door swung in, and as it did, the snake's dead body swung in towards her like a fat length of rope. My mouth made a surprised "oh," and she screamed and slammed the door back shut, disappearing from view to shriek inside the house while the snake thumped heavily against the front of our house. "Someone call Sheriff Jensen," Mr. McBride said to the growing crowd of neighbors. He looked down at Dawn, and placed a hand on top of her red knitted hat. "It's all right, sweetheart. It can't hurt you." At his words, Dawn started to cry. Dawn never was afraid of snakes. That wasn't why she had screamed. She had screamed because someone had killed the poor thing. "Tell him not to bring Bert," I called to Mrs. Schumann, who was hurrying back to her house to call my dad. "Tell her that no matter what, he needs to keep Bert away." "It was Bert's snake," I explained to Matt. "He took it in after someone left it in the front seat of Percy's car." He blinked at me and looked at the snake. It had nearly stopped swaying after being disturbed, but the movement had made the scene more gruesome. She had slid and rolled over her own dripped blood and smeared it in an arc. "How do you know it's the same one?" Matt asked. I didn't respond. I couldn't be sure, not then. I just knew that it was. Later, poor Bert would confirm it when he found her cage empty, though we couldn't say how she'd been taken. There was no evidence of forced entry. He figured that one of his window's latches was faulty or that someone had picked the lock on the back door. Poor Bert. He hadn't had her so long, but he loved that snake. While we waited for my dad, Dad and I lingered on the front lawn with our backs to the door. My mom chose to remain in the house on the other side of it. I don't think she wanted to face the crowd. I saw her peering out at us through the curtains in the kitchen, gave her a small nod. Then I tugged Dawn closer. I had her. My mother didn't need to worry. Behind us, I heard a familiar click and whir and caught the light of a flash bulb. Mr. McBride was kneeling at the base of our front porch steps and taking photographs. "I didn't know you had your camera," I said. "I asked Maggie to get it from the car." He gestured back towards town. "We're parked not far up Pine." He snapped off a few more photos and changed the angle, stepping up onto the porch like I had given him permission. "Are those from my father?" I asked. He lowered the camera. "Well, yes, he's welcome to them, but they're also for the paper." "The paper? You'd publish this? Our house in the paper?" He looked down. "Mr. McBride, Dawn's already having trouble at school because of the case."